"You're fired." The words hung in the air of the prestigious law firm's corner office as Robert Kennedy smirked at his most successful junior partner. But Dominic Harris didn't flinch. Instead, he placed a single thumb drive on the polished mahogany desk, one that contained enough evidence to bring down not just Kennedy, but an entire corrupt empire. Sometimes revenge requires losing the battle to win the war. The mahogany doors of Kennedy and martial law swung open with practiced precision as Dominic Harris straightened his Ivy League tie. After 3 years as the firm's most successful junior partner, his designer suits and polished demeanor had become as much a part of the office landscape as the pretentious oil paintings that lined the walls. But today, something was different. The weight of the envelope in his briefcase felt like a ticking bomb. The mahogany doors of Kennedy and martial law swung open with practiced precision as Dominic Harris straightened his Ivy League tie. After 3 years as the firm's most successful junior partner, his designer suits and polished demeanor had become as much a part of the office landscape as the pretentious oil paintings that lined the walls. But today, something was different. The weight of the envelope in his briefcase felt like a ticking bomb. "You're late, Harris." Robert Kennedy's voice cut through the morning bustle of the office. The senior partner, a man whose silver hair and country club membership seemed to matter more than his legal expertise, stood in the doorway of his corner office, face pinched with barely concealed disdain. "Traffic was brutal on the bridge, sir," Dominic replied smoothly, though they both knew the real reason for Kennedy's irritation had nothing to do with punctuality. The whispers had been growing louder ever since Dominic landed the Morrison account, a billion-dollar tech company that had traditionally been Kennedy's personal client base. "Well, since you seem to have so much free time," Kennedy drawled, "you can handle the Phillips case. Pro bono." He smirked, dropping a thin file on Dominic's desk. "Unless that's beneath your newfound status." Dominic maintained his professional smile, even as he recognized the power play. The Phillips case was exactly the kind of low-profile busywork that Kennedy had been pushing his way lately. "Not at all, sir. Happy to help." Kennedy lingered, clearly disappointed by the lack of reaction. "Oh, and Harris? The board meeting's been moved up. 2 o'clock. He turned to leave, then added with false casualness, "Try not to be late for that one. Wouldn't want anyone questioning your commitment to the firm's culture." As Kennedy's footsteps faded, Dominic's colleague and friend, Sarah Chen, appeared at his desk. "That man needs a hobby that isn't being a racist jackass," she muttered. "You okay?" Dominic's shoulders relaxed slightly. Sarah had been his ally since day one of the few associates who saw past both his skin color and his rapid rise through the ranks. "I'm fine, but I think our esteemed senior partner is about to have a very interesting afternoon." Sarah raised an eyebrow at his cryptic response. "Dom, what are you planning?" He patted his briefcase. "Let's just say I've been doing some extra research lately, the kind that would make our friends in the ethics committee very interested." "The kickbacks?" Sarah whispered, eyes widening. "You found proof?" Dominic nodded slightly. The consulting fees that Kennedy had been charging to certain clients, fees that somehow never made it into the firm's official books, had been an open secret for years. But proving it was another matter entirely. "Just be in that board meeting," he said quietly, "and maybe bring popcorn." As Sarah returned to her desk, Dominic opened the Phillips case file, but his mind was elsewhere. 3 years of subtle discrimination, passed-over promotions, and backhanded comments had led to this moment. He thought about his father, who'd worked 2 jobs to put him through law school, always telling him that excellence was the best revenge. "Make them eat their words with your success, son," he'd said, "but make sure you do it clean." The morning crawled by, filled with the usual parade of client calls and court filings. Dominic handled each task with his characteristic thoroughness, all while keeping one eye on the clock. At lunch, he declined Sarah's invitation to join the usual crowd at the deli downstairs, instead pulling out his phone to make a call. "Everything set?" he asked quietly. "All good," replied Marcus Washington, his old college roommate, and now a senior investigator with the State Bar Association. Are you sure about this, Dom? Kennedy's got friends in high places." "That's exactly why this needs to happen," Dominic responded. "Some people think they're untouchable. Time they learn different." At 1:55 p.m., Dominic gathered his materials and headed toward the conference room. He could feel Kennedy watching him from the corner office, probably assuming this would be another opportunity to put the uppity junior partner in his place. The thought almost made him smile. The conference room filled quickly with the firm's senior partners and board members. Kennedy took his usual place at the head of the table, radiating smug authority. "Well then," he began, "let's discuss the quarterly numbers, shall we? Harris, since you're so interested in the firm's financial dealings lately, why don't you start?" Dominic stood slowly, making eye contact with each person around the table. "Actually, sir, I'd like to discuss a different set of numbers first." He reached into his briefcase and removed several thick folders. "Specifically, The discrepancy between the official billing records and certain private arrangements you've made with our top clients. The room went deadly quiet. Kennedy's face flushed red, then pale. What the hell are you talking about? I'm talking about the systematic overbilling and kickback scheme you've been running for the past decade. Dominic replied calmly, passing out copies of his documentation. The one you've been using to fund your gambling habit at the Westbrook Country Club. The same country club, I might add, where you told the membership committee that hiring me was just to satisfy the diversity quotas. Kennedy shot to his feet. How dare you? This is ridiculous. You have no proof. Actually, a new voice interjected from the doorway. He has quite a lot of proof. Marcus Washington stepped into the room, flanked by two other investigators from the state bar. Mr. Kennedy, we've been building this case for months. Mr. Harris's documentation was just the final piece we needed. The color drained from Kennedy's face as Marcus laid out a series of documents on the conference table. We have statements from clients, bank records, and recorded conversations that outline a pattern of fraudulent billing practices spanning nearly 12 years. This is absurd, Kennedy sputtered, his carefully maintained composure cracking. You can't possibly believe the word of. He gestured dismissively toward Dominic, seemingly unable to even say his name. The word of what, Mr. Kennedy? Dominic's voice remained perfectly level. A Harvard Law graduate, a junior partner who's brought in more new clients this year than anyone else in the firm. Or were you going to say something else? Sarah, who had been quietly taking notes, couldn't suppress a small smile as she watched Kennedy flounder. The senior partner's legendary composure was unraveling thread by thread. I built this firm. Kennedy's fist slammed against the mahogany table. Everything I did was to maintain our standards, our reputation. And now you're going to let this affirmative actions hire destroy everything? The room collectively inhaled at the slur, but Dominic didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled out one final document from his briefcase. Actually, Mr. Kennedy, I think this might interest the board even more than the financial fraud. He slid the paper across the table to Margaret Marshall, the firm's other founding partner, who had been watching the proceedings with sharp eyes. This is a transcript of Mr. Kennedy's conversation with the hiring committee last month, specifically his directions about maintaining the firm's traditional image. When reviewing new associate applications, Margaret Marshall's eyes narrowed as she read. In her 30 years as a founding partner, she'd earned a reputation for zero tolerance of discrimination, a fact Kennedy seemed to have forgotten in his arrogance. Robert, she said, her voice arctic, would you care to explain why you instructed HR to lose applications from certain demographics? Maggie, you can't seriously, Kennedy began, but she cut him off with a raised hand. Mr. Washington, she addressed the bar investigator. I trust you have copies of all this documentation? Marcus nodded. Yes, ma'am. We've been building this case methodically. Mr. Harris has been instrumental in gathering evidence, all while enduring Mr. Kennedy's increasingly hostile work environment. Hostile? Kennedy laughed desperately. I gave him opportunities, made him partner ahead of schedule. After passing me over 3 times, Dominic interjected quietly, until the Morrison account threatened to leave because they wanted more diversity in their legal representation. Funny how that worked out. The board members were now poring over the documents, their expressions growing darker by the minute. The numbers were damning enough, but the pattern of discrimination detailed in Kennedy's own emails and memos painted a picture of systemic bias that threatened the firm's reputation far more than any financial impropriety. I move for an immediate suspension of Mr. Kennedy's partnership privileges pending a full investigation, Margaret Marshall announced, her voice carrying the weight of 3 decades of authority. All in favor. The raised hands around the table were unanimous. Kennedy stared in disbelief as his empire crumbled around him. You can't do this, he whispered, but the fight had drained from his voice. My family, my reputation. You should have thought about that before you decided talent and integrity were less important than skin color, Margaret replied coldly. She turned to the bar investigators. Gentlemen, I believe you have what you need. Marcus nodded, gathering the documents. We'll be in touch regarding next steps. Mr. Kennedy, I suggest you contact legal representation. The irony of a lawyer needing to hire a lawyer wasn't lost on anyone in the room. As Kennedy was escorted from the conference room, Margaret turned to Dominic. Mr. Harris, I believe we owe you an apology, and perhaps a conversation about your future with the firm. Dominic raised an eyebrow. My future? We're going to need a new senior partner, she said with a slight smile. Someone who understands that excellence comes in all colors. She glanced at the stunned faces around the table. Unless anyone objects. The silence was deafening. Later that evening, as the news of Kennedy's suspension rippled through the legal community, Dominic sat in his office, staring at the city lights beyond his window. Sarah appeared in his doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee. So, she said, settling into a chair, How long have you been planning this? Since the day he told me I should be grateful for the partnership, Dominic replied, accepting the coffee. But I knew I couldn't just catch him in one mistake. Had to let him get comfortable, let him think he was untouchable. Like a chess game, Sarah mused. You sacrificed a few pieces to get the king. More like I let him sacrifice his own pieces. Pride comes before the fall. Isn't that what they say? The following weeks brought sweeping changes to Kennedy and Marshall Law, soon to be renamed Marshall Harris Chin and Associates. The transformation went far beyond just replacing the disgraced partner's name on the letterhead. Under Dominic's leadership as the new senior partner, the firm began a comprehensive review of its hiring practices, client relationships, and corporate culture. But not everyone was celebrating Kennedy's downfall. One morning, Dominic arrived to find James Peterson, a longtime Kennedy loyalist, waiting in his office. Enjoying your coup? Peterson's voice dripped with barely concealed hostility. Must be proud of yourself, destroying a man's entire legacy. Dominic settled behind his desk, studying the older lawyer carefully. Kennedy destroyed his own legacy, James. I just made sure everyone saw it. He built this firm from nothing. No, Dominic corrected quietly. He built it on Margaret Marshall's reputation, while slowly corrupting everything she stood for. There's a difference. He pulled out a file from his desk. Speaking of corruption, would you like to explain these billing discrepancies in your own accounts? Peterson's face went ashen. You're investigating me? The Bar Association is investigating everyone who was part of Kennedy's inner circle. Did you think this was just about racism? It's about integrity, James. Something this firm is going to have again. As Peterson stumbled out of the office, Sarah entered with a stack of resumes. First batch of new associate applications, she announced. Word's getting out that we're actually reviewing candidates based on merit now. Dominic began sorting through the applications. Any standouts? Third one down, Sarah replied. Michelle Rodriguez, Harvard Law Review, clinical honors, stellar recommendations. Kennedy rejected her twice because her name didn't fit the firm's image. Set up an interview, Dominic said. And Sarah, make sure Peterson's cases get a thorough review. I have a feeling he's not the only one who followed Kennedy's example. The investigation expanded like ripples in a pond. Other firms in the city began conducting their own internal audits. Worried about similar scandals, the Bar Association launched a broader inquiry into discriminatory practices in the legal community. Kennedy's downfall had triggered a long overdue reckoning. But the real changes were happening within the firm itself. The previously silent support staff began speaking up about past incidents of discrimination. Junior associates from diverse backgrounds shared stories of subtle barriers and not so subtle slights they'd encountered. Each revelation strengthened Dominic's resolve to transform the firm's culture from the ground up. One afternoon, as Dominic was reviewing case files, his secretary announced an unexpected visitor, Robert Kennedy Jr., Kennedy's son and a partner at a rival firm. Come to defend your father's honor? Dominic asked as the younger Kennedy entered. Actually, Kennedy Jr. shifted uncomfortably. I came to apologize and to share some information you might find interesting. He placed a USB drive on Dominic's desk. Dad's network goes deeper than you know. Other firms, judges, even some people at the Bar Association itself. This has all his records, including some he thought he'd deleted. I found it in his home office. Dominic raised an eyebrow. Why are you giving me this? Because you were right, Kennedy Jr. said quietly. About all of it. I watched him twist everything good about the law into something ugly. Watched him teach others to do the same. Maybe it's time someone finally broke the cycle. As Kennedy Jr. left, Sarah appeared in the doorway. Can we trust him? We'll verify everything on the drive, Dominic replied. But I think he's genuine. Sometimes seeing your hero fall makes you question everything they taught you. The drive proved to be a goldmine of information, revealing a network of discriminatory practices and financial fraud that stretched across multiple firms and institutions. Each revelation brought new challenges, but also opportunities for reform. Margaret Marshall, who had taken on an advisory role while Dominic led the day-to-day operations, watched the transformation with satisfaction. You know, she said during one late-night strategy session, when I started this firm, I dreamed it would stand for something more than just making money. Kennedy made me doubt that dream was possible. You're bringing it back to life. Dominic thought about all the young lawyers who would now have opportunities they'd been denied before. It's not just about changing policies, he said. It's about changing mindsets, making people understand that diversity isn't just a buzzword. It's how you build something that lasts. The firm's reputation grew, not just for its legal expertise, but for its commitment to equity and justice. Other firms began approaching them for guidance on implementing similar changes. Dominic found himself speaking at law schools and bar associations, sharing not just his story, but a vision for what the legal profession could become. But success brought its own challenges. Late one evening, As Dominic was preparing for a major case, he received a call from Marcus Washington at the Bar Association. "We've got a problem," Marcus said without preamble. "Kennedy's not going down quietly. He's filing a countersuit, claiming you fabricated evidence and coerced clients into making false statements, and he's got some powerful people backing him." "Of course he is," Dominic replied, rubbing his temples. "Who's backing him?" "Judge Harrison, for one," Marcus said grimly. "Remember those country club connections you mentioned? Turns out they run deep. Harrison's agreed to hear the case, and word is he's already made up his mind." Dominic leaned back in his chair, thinking of Judge William Harrison. Old money, older prejudices, and a reputation for protecting the right sort of people. Any other good news? Several witnesses are getting cold feet. Kennedy's people have been making calls, reminding people of favors owed and secrets kept. And Marcus hesitated. "There's talk about your father." Dominic's grip tightened on the phone. "What about my father?" They're digging into his business dealings from the 90s, suggesting there might be some irregularities with his contracting company. "Nothing concrete, but enough to make me look like I have a vendetta," Dominic finished. "Make it seem personal instead of professional." After ending the call, Dominic sat in his darkened office, watching the city lights flicker below. His father had worked himself to the bone building his small construction company, taking every contract he could get to put Dominic through school. The idea of Kennedy's people tarnishing that legacy made his blood boil. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Sarah stood in the doorway, concern etched on her face. "That bad?" "Worse," he replied, filling her in on Kennedy's counterattack. Sarah listened intently, then smiled, a sharp, determined expression that reminded Dominic why she was one of the firm's most feared litigators. "You know what this means, right? We've got them scared. Scared enough to fight dirty. Then we fight smarter." She pulled out her tablet, fingers flying over the screen. "Remember Lisa Chen from the Morrison account? Her sister sits on the Judicial Review Board. And that USB drive Kennedy Jr. gave us? I've been cross-referencing the deleted files with Judge Harrison's case history. There's a pattern you need to see." Over the next hour, they pieced together a complex web of connections. Judge Harrison had been steering cases toward Kennedy's preferred outcomes for years, while Kennedy had arranged for the judge's son to receive cushy consulting contracts from grateful clients. "It's not just about racism anymore," Sarah mused. "This is about the whole system of favors and backroom deals they've built. No wonder they're fighting so hard to protect it." "Then maybe it's time to change the battlefield," Dominic said slowly, an idea forming. "Kennedy wants to make this personal. Let's give him what he wants, just not the way he expects." The next morning, instead of filing a response to Kennedy's lawsuit, Dominic called a press conference. Standing before a forest of microphones, with his father seated proudly in the front row, he laid out not just Kennedy's discrimination, but the entire corrupt system it represented. "This isn't about one man's prejudice," he declared, his voice steady and clear. "It's about a culture that values connections over competence, tradition over talent, and the comfort of the few over the rights of the many. Mr. Kennedy claims I fabricated evidence against him. The truth is, he fabricated an entire system of privilege and called it merit." He proceeded to outline specific cases where Judge Harrison had shown clear bias, backed by data and documentation. He revealed the network of fake consulting contracts and inflated billing hours that had enriched a select group while denying opportunities to others. But most powerfully, he shared stories, dozens of them, from lawyers of color, women, and other marginalized groups who had faced similar discrimination across multiple firms. "My father taught me that success is the best revenge," Dominic continued, his voice carrying emotion for the first time. "But he also taught me that true success isn't just about personal victory. It's about making sure others have the same opportunities you fought for." Mr. Kennedy didn't just try to hold me back. He tried to hold back an entire generation of talented lawyers who didn't fit his narrow vision of what a lawyer should look like. The press conference exploded across social media. Lawyers for Change started trending as similar stories poured in from across the country. Other firms' diversity statistics were scrutinized. The Judicial Review Board announced an investigation into Judge Harrison's case history. Kennedy's countersuit suddenly looked less like a legitimate legal challenge and more like a desperate attempt to silence a whistleblower. His remaining allies began distancing themselves, unwilling to face the public scrutiny. But the real impact came from an unexpected source. That evening, as Dominic was preparing to leave the office, he received another visitor, Judge Harrison's daughter, Catherine. "I've been working at the public defender's office for 3 years, she said without preamble, under a different name, so my father wouldn't find out. I've seen exactly what you're talking about. Cases getting assigned to specific judges, plea deals mysteriously falling through, sentencing disparities that can't be explained by anything except prejudice." She placed a thick folder on his desk. "This is everything I've documented. Names, dates, Patterns of behavior. Dad always said he was protecting our family's legacy, but this corruption, this isn't a legacy worth protecting. Catherine Harrison's documents proved to be the key that unlocked a vault of systemic corruption. The patterns she documented in the public defender's office painted a disturbing picture. Defendants of color consistently receiving harsher sentences, public defenders being pressured to accept unfavorable plea deals, and evidence mysteriously going missing in cases involving wealthy white defendants. It's like a parallel legal system, Sarah said, spreading the documents across the conference room table. The team had been working through the night, connecting dots and building timelines. One for the privileged, another for everyone else. Dominic nodded grimly, and Kennedy and Harrison were the gatekeepers. But as they dug deeper, the case became more dangerous. One morning, Dominic arrived at work to find his office had been broken into. Nothing was taken, but his files were clearly rifled through. A warning. Then came the anonymous threats. The suspicious cars parked outside his home. The whispered conversations that stopped when he entered rooms at the courthouse. "They're trying to scare you off," Marcus warned during a secure call. "These people, they're not just lawyers and judges. They've got connections to real power, political donors, corporate boards, people who don't like their boats being rocked." "Let them rock," Dominic replied, though his voice betrayed his exhaustion. The strain was starting to show. In the long hours, the constant vigilance, the weight of responsibility for not just his own career, but for everyone who had trusted him with their stories. Sarah noticed his fatigue. "You know," she said one evening, forcing him to leave the office before midnight, "Kennedy's not the only one with powerful friends." She was right. As the evidence mounted, support began pouring in from unexpected quarters. Junior partners at other firms started coming forward with their own documentation of discriminatory practices. Court clerks anonymously shared records of suspicious case assignments. Even some of Kennedy's old clients, tired of the kickback schemes and inflated bills, began cooperating with the investigation. But the most surprising ally emerged from Kennedy's own past. Janet Morrison, the founder of the tech company that had originally insisted on diverse representation, turned out to have a personal stake in the fight. Her grandfather, she revealed, had been one of the first black lawyers to pass the bar in their state, only to be systematically excluded from practicing by the same old boy network that Kennedy had inherited and perpetuated. "My grandfather died thinking he'd failed," she told Dominic during a private meeting. "He never knew the system was rigged against him. I built my company promising myself I'd never let that kind of discrimination stand. When I heard what you were doing," she smiled, a steel edge in her expression. "Let's just say I've been waiting for someone to take this fight public." Morrison's support changed the game. With her tech company's resources and connections, they began building a comprehensive database of discriminatory patterns across the legal system. Each piece of evidence was backed up on secure servers, protected from tampering or accidental deletion. The pressure began to tell on Kennedy's camp. Judge Harrison abruptly announced his retirement, citing health concerns. Several partner-level lawyers at other firms resigned quietly. The Bar Association expanded its investigation to include the entire circuit court system. But Kennedy himself remained defiant. One rainy evening, he confronted Dominic in the parking garage after work. "You think you've won?" Kennedy's voice echoed off the concrete walls. "You think exposing all this makes you some kind of hero? You're destroying institutions that took generations to build." "No," Dominic replied calmly, though his heart was racing. "I'm exposing institutions that failed their fundamental purpose. Justice isn't supposed to have a color, Kennedy, or a country club membership." "You naive fool," Kennedy spat. "You think changing the rules changes human nature? There will always be an inner circle, always be people who know how to work the system. All you're doing is making it harder for everyone." "Maybe," Dominic acknowledged, "but at least now everyone will know the system exists, and that's the first step to changing it." He turned to walk away, but Kennedy grabbed his arm. "I still have one card left to play," he hissed. "One story that could change everything. About your perfect father and a certain construction project in '95. About corners cut and inspections bought. Want to test how clean his hands really were?" For a moment, Dominic felt the old rage rise up. The fury at seeing everything he and his family had worked for, threatened by this man's desperation. But then he remembered something his father had told him long ago. "Son, when a man shows you who he really is, believe him the first time." "Go ahead," Dominic said quietly, removing Kennedy's hand from his arm. "Release whatever story you want. But first, you might want to check who the building inspector was for that project and who signed off on the permits." "Because I did, Kennedy. I checked everything before I ever made my first move against you. That's the difference between us. I did my homework." He stepped into his car, leaving Kennedy standing in the dim garage light, the last of his threats evaporating in the evening air. But as Dominic drove home, he knew this wasn't over. Kennedy represented more than just one prejudiced lawyer. He represented a mindset, a system, a way of doing business that wouldn't die easily. The next morning, Dominic arrived at his office to find Katherine Harrison waiting for him, her face pale. "They're making a move," she said without preamble. "Dad, Kennedy, all of them. They're calling in every favor they have left." She handed him a stack of paper, leaked emails, and meeting minutes from an emergency gathering of the city's most powerful legal and business figures. The old guard was circling the wagons, preparing for all-out war. "They're not just targeting you anymore," Katherine explained. "They're going after everyone who supported you." Morrison's company is suddenly facing surprise regulatory audits. Sarah's old cases are being randomly reviewed. They're even pressuring the Bar Association to suspend Marcus's investigation. Dominic scanned the documents, his jaw tightening. "They're trying to isolate us, make an example." "That's not all," Katherine continued. "They're planning to use the media. They've hired a PR firm to paint this as a radical attack on the legal system itself. They're going to claim you're part of a coordinated effort to undermine traditional legal institutions." Sarah burst into the office, waving her tablet. "Have you seen the morning news? They're running stories about activist lawyers, threatening judicial independence. 3 different networks, same talking points." Dominic sat back, thinking hard. Kennedy's desperate garage threat hadn't worked, so now they were escalating to full-scale character assassination. But something about the coordinated response felt off. "Why now?" he mused aloud. "Why go nuclear when they were already losing ground?" Janet Morrison called just as he was puzzling it out. "Check your email," she said without greeting. "My tech team found something interesting in those court records we've been analyzing." The email contained a single spreadsheet with dates highlighted in red. As Dominic studied it, the pattern became clear. Kennedy's network hadn't just been manipulating individual cases, they'd been systematically timing judgments and settlements to manipulate stock prices, real estate values, even municipal bond rates. "It's not just about racism or old boy networks," Janet explained. "That was just their cover. They've been running a sophisticated financial scheme through the courts for decades. The discrimination was part of it, keeping certain people out to maintain control. But the real game was market manipulation." Everything clicked into place. The desperate counterattack, the media blitz, the regulatory pressure. They weren't just protecting their reputations, they were protecting an enormous financial conspiracy. "How much?" Dominic asked quietly. "Billions," Janet replied. "And that's just what we can trace so far. My team is still digging, but we're finding connections to offshore accounts, shell companies, even some political action committees." Dominic hung up and turned to Sarah and Katherine. "Get everyone in here, now. And I mean everyone. Every clerk, paralegal, and associate who's been helping us. It's time to show our full hand." Within an hour, the conference room was packed. Dominic stood at the head of the table, looking at the faces of people who had risked their careers to fight for change. Some he'd known for years. Others had joined the cause along the way, but all shared the same determined expression. "They think they can intimidate us because that's how they've always operated," he began. "Through fear, through threats, through the quiet understanding that speaking up costs too much. But they've made a crucial mistake." He gestured to the evidence spread across the table. "They thought this was about race, about keeping people like me in our place. But that was just their smokescreen for something much bigger. And now, thanks to everyone in this room, we can prove it." Sarah stepped forward. "We've been documenting the discrimination because it was obvious, personal, infuriating. But look at these patterns." She pulled up a series of charts. Every major discriminatory ruling corresponds with significant market movements. They weren't just denying justice, they were profiting from it. Katherine nodded grimly. "That's why my father was so insistent on controlling which judges got which cases. It wasn't just about protecting their friends, it was about timing the outcomes for maximum financial impact." The room erupted in discussion as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about civil rights anymore. It was about systematic corruption of the entire judicial system for profit. "So what's our play?" Marcus asked from his position by the door. "This is bigger than the Bar Association now. We're talking federal investigations, SEC involvement." Dominic smiled for the first time that day. "Actually, they're already involved." He pressed a button on his phone, and a new voice joined the conversation on speaker. "This is Special Agent Torres from the FBI's Public Corruption Division," the voice announced. "And Mr. Harris has been working with us for the past month, building what might be the largest case of judicial corruption in state history." The room fell silent as Agent Torres continued. "That media blitz they're planning, let them run it. Every public statement they make will just add to our evidence of conspiracy. Sometimes you have to let the target think they're winning before you spring the trap." The next 48 hours unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony. While Kennedy's media blitz painted Dominic as a dangerous radical attacking the foundations of justice, FBI agents were quietly serving warrants across the city. Bank records were seized, computers confiscated, and decades of carefully hidden financial transactions laid bare. The morning headlines screamed of judicial corruption and market manipulation. Kennedy's attempt to control the narrative backfired spectacularly as reporters, armed with leaked documents from Morrison's tech team, began connecting the dots between discriminatory rulings and suspicious market activities. But the final blow came from an unexpected source. As federal agents prepared to arrest Judge Harrison, the old man made one last call to his daughter, Catherine. "Tell Harris he won," was all he said before surrendering himself to authorities. The arrests started at dawn. Partners at major firms, court administrators, even 2 state legislators were led away in handcuffs. Kennedy himself was taken into custody while trying to board a private plane to the Cayman Islands. Dominic watched the news coverage from his office, his father sitting quietly beside him. The same networks that had questioned his motives days earlier were now hailing him as a whistleblower who had exposed systemic corruption. "You didn't just beat them, son," his father said softly. "You changed the game." Sarah appeared in the doorway, holding a thick envelope. The Bar Association's final report just came in. They're recommending disbarment for everyone involved in the scheme. And, she smiled, they want you to head the commission on reforming the judiciary's ethics guidelines. Dominic shook his head. No, that job should go to Catherine Harrison. She's the one who sacrificed everything to expose her own father's corruption. Sometimes the best person to rebuild a system is someone who knows exactly how it was broken. In the weeks that followed, the true scope of Kennedy's network emerged. The financial scheme had touched everything from real estate developments to corporate mergers, using discriminatory rulings as cover for market manipulation. By keeping certain lawyers and judges out of the system, they had maintained control over case outcomes and their lucrative side effects. But more importantly, as the old power structure crumbled, new opportunities emerged. The firms caught in the scandal were required to implement sweeping reforms, opening doors that had long been closed to minorities and women. The judiciary established new random case assignment protocols and strict financial disclosure requirements. 1 year later, Dominic stood before a packed auditorium at his alma mater, addressing a new generation of law students. The story of how one black lawyer's fight against discrimination had uncovered a vast criminal conspiracy had become a cautionary tale in legal ethics courses across the country. The law isn't just about statutes and precedents, he told the eager faces before him. It's about courage. The courage to stand up when it would be easier to stay quiet. The courage to dig deeper when others tell you to leave well enough alone. But most importantly, it's about justice, real justice, not the kind that can be bought and sold. He glanced at the front row, where his father sat beside Sarah, Catherine, and Janet Morrison. Marcus was there too, now heading an expanded civil rights division at the Bar Association. "They thought they could stop us by making it personal," he continued. "What they didn't understand was that justice is always personal. Every discriminatory ruling, every case steered to a friendly judge, every qualified candidate passed over, those weren't just statistics. They were people, dreams denied, lives altered, families affected. But here's what I learned from this fight. Change doesn't come from exposing corruption alone. It comes from replacing it with something better. When we took down Kennedy's network, we weren't just tearing down an old system. We were making space for a new one built on merit, transparency, and equal justice under law." As he concluded his speech, Dominic remembered that first confrontation in the office, when Kennedy had tried to put him in his place with a pro bono case. The memory brought not anger, but a sense of completion. Kennedy had wanted to teach him to stay in his lane. Instead, he taught the entire legal community a different lesson, that true justice knows no color, that corruption can wear an expensive suit and a respected name, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon against prejudice is simply the courage to keep digging until you expose the truth. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for him. It was for every person who had ever faced discrimination and chosen to fight back, for every whistleblower who had risked everything to expose corruption, for every young lawyer who now saw a path forward that didn't require compromising their integrity. As he left the podium, Dominic caught sight of his reflection in the auditorium's glass doors. He saw not just his own face, but the faces of everyone who had fought this battle with him. The victory hadn't just been about taking down one racist boss. It had been about dismantling an entire system of injustice, one carefully documented piece of evidence at a time. And that, he realized, was the greatest revenge of all.